All right. So I've been teaching human rights for 20 years, and teaching world hunger would come up. Human rights is very much an international discussion, guided by international law, but a colleague and I got to wondering what's going on at UNM. And so we did a little survey. The USDA has a validated instrument. We didn't have to invent it. And then someone said, can you include housing and security? Because the Gateway Center was under discussion. So we said, sure. And my usual answer was, sure, give me the money, I can do it. Mostly we wanted money for student incentives. Take our survey, we'll give you 10 bucks. It's now grown to 40 bucks. But anyway, we did 2 years of research at UNM, and then it caught the attention of the higher education department, and they asked us to do a statewide study. And so, if you can go to the next slide, please. In 2023, in the spring of 2023, we did a survey, and we had 27 out of the 29 public institutions of higher ed participate. And we included faculty and staff. We might be the only ones to ever include faculty and staff. There's been about 15 years of data on college student food insecurity, a little less on housing insecurity, but none on faculty and staff. Nonetheless, next slide. This is our overall results. So an enormous amount of food insecurity. 58% for students. Housing insecurity is even worse, and 13% of our participants were homeless students. So we're talking thousands and thousands of people that just took our survey. There was about 10,000 students and 4,000 faculty and staff, but there's about 120,000 students. So if it's 50% of 120,000, you're starting to get the picture. Next slide. The USDA has 4 levels of food security: high, marginal, low, and very low. And you put the bottom 2 levels together to come up with the food insecurity figure. Low food security means you might be getting enough calories, just not necessarily healthy calories. Very low food security means you're skipping meals. The USDA used to have the word hunger attached to it. We think the word hunger should be attached to it from what we're hearing from our colleagues. The majority of every cohort in our study were at very low. So we have a substantial number of people in higher ed skipping meals and experiencing hunger. Next slide. So we compared the 3 types of institutions in New Mexico, except private: tribal, 2-year, and 4-year. The red and the pink are the low food security. Red is very low. Pink is just low. I hate to use the word just, because that's not just either. And the 2-year and 4-year are pretty similar. Across the country, community colleges tend to have more food and housing insecurity because they attract lower income students. But here in New Mexico, it's all the groups. Next slide. By race, ethnicity, I don't know why there's only 4 on here, but all cohorts were over 50% food insecure. And Native American students who are in all the schools, this isn't just the tribal colleges, are at 70%. And then of course, African American are right under Native Americans. And Hispanic students, who are the majority of UNM students, 57%. Next slide. Housing insecurity, 80% at our tribal institutions. 65% at 2-year, almost 60% at 4-year. Housing insecurity is on a scale from couch surfing to homelessness, only there's another scale for the homelessness. Students often people don't admit that or don't even consider themselves homeless if they've got a roof over their head. It might be somebody else's roof. So we measured it 2 ways. Are you homeless? Yes, no. Or a calculated. How many times, are you sleeping in an inappropriate place, in an overcrowded place? These are validated instruments. We didn't make this up. Next slide. Okay, so this is the homelessness. So even within our sample, this is several thousand students in New Mexico who are homeless and sleeping in their cars. Next slide. Other things that we associated with, it's not just one problem, and so there's not a simple solution. The transportation is on here. That's the first one, highlighted in green. Students who have very low food security have high transportation issues. Health services, GPA is the third green one on the bottom left. But no surprise, students who are food insecure have lower GPAs. Think of Maslow's hierarchy of need. If you don't have food and shelter, how are you going to get to the higher levels of thinking? The second to last one is how many people provide a financial contribution to somebody else. So this is different than just you have kids, of which we know there's a huge number of students who have children, but 60% of our students contribute to someone financially. So as we start to think about resolving these issues, what does it mean when you live in community? And we've been treating as if it's a problem of an individual, and this whole individualism rhetoric in America is skewed because this is not people's reality. 63% are employed, part-time or full-time, but a huge amount work full-time, sometimes 2 jobs. Next slide. Next slide, getting into causes when I'm teaching about this, I think this is Feeding America on the right, provides these 3 causes: systemic racism, housing costs, low income, and as you saw, our students of color, our LGBTQ+ students experience most of these insecurities, and students tend to work in the low-wage jobs in the hospitality industry. And then, of course, there's the immediate things that happen to people all the time. You know, you have a health emergency, a car breakdown, your tooth chips, and these kinds of things force people out of college. What if we had an emergency scholarship, or we would argue just an emergency grant? Sometimes we can keep people in school for a couple $100 or a couple thousand. We have to build, and it's got to be quick. And some schools have relationships, I don't know of any in New Mexico, with a mechanic, a local mechanic, that the school pays straight to the local mechanic. Or the whole emergency housing. I think UNM has a little bit of emergency housing. They have a relationship with a hotel, and they pay for 30-day stay. There's a ton of solutions. I think, is that my next slide? Oh no, these are some other causes. The cost of attendance has gone up at public universities. Now we have the Opportunity Scholarship, so I need to change this slide. But things aren't the way they were when I was a Pell Grant student. When I was on the lowest income, and Pell Grant covered 80% of tuition fees and living expenses. Now it's less than a third. So school prices are going up. Student fees, our students still have to pay their student fees. They're growing hugely. My students did the calculation for me in class this week, and I think every student at UNM is spending $850 a year or a semester, and they don't know where it goes. I mean, we looked into where it goes, to the gym. Well, but I never use the gym, one of them says to me, or to, who knows, I can't remember what the breakdown is, but students aren't having a lot of say, so we're working on getting them to speak up for their fees. Next slide. Next slide. So I teach human rights, and Americans don't use the language of human rights very much, but food and shelter are basic human rights. They're on Maslow's basic hierarchy of needs. They're at the fundamental level, but they're also a human right that the entire world acknowledges. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Even on the US State Department of Labor and Human Rights, they have a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt holding the UDHR. It's a declaration, so it's not a law. It's easy to say, yeah, we like it. It's a good idea, because they don't have to do anything about it. But then the UDHR has been turned into law, a variety of laws, a variety of covenants, and the ones that legalize food insecurity, a right to food, the US hasn't signed. There's something called the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It used to be us and Somalia who had not signed it. Somalia, a failed state, managed to sign it in the last few years. The US still has not signed the Rights of the Child, which puts the right to food into law, for example. But maybe we should use this rhetoric much more. All the religions of the world, all the major world's philosophies recognize food as a basic human need and right. And in fact, the Universal Declaration came out of the world's religions and philosophies in 1948 at the end of World War II. Okay, next slide. And so I really like this political philosopher at Harvard who has developed a framework about how to think about unfulfilled rights. Another political scientist had said, hunger is an orphan issue. It's complicated. It's not clear to say whose fault it is. And without being able to pinpoint an exact target, we have a hard time pinpointing responsibility. Well, let's get over that. We don't have to figure out who's responsible. We all have responsibility to do something about it. And she would say, who's connected to the problem? So in higher ed, it's our institutions and our legislators. So we ask who is connected to the problem and what can we do together moving forward? And this is the philosophy I preach. Next slide. So everybody can do something about it. At the state level, I think my colleague in the higher education department wrote these bullet points. The big one that we need to work on the bottom left, allow attendance to count as the work requirement for SNAP. Right now, college students have to prove they work 20 hours a week. It's very hard for some students. Work study is usually 20 hours, and a colleague told me who manages work-study students, my office is open from 9 to 5, and if they can't fit in 20 hours with their work schedule, I can't get them 20 hours of work. Or my nephew was on work-study by working at the gym. The gym closes at Christmas. The gym closes on breaks. He gets dumped off SNAP, and then it's hard to get back on, and he's got to make an appointment, some similar things we heard from Emily. But another thing having to do with SNAP is the second bullet point on the right. I've read an article that said 80% of colleges and universities don't even do SNAP outreach. $3 billion is left on the table by eligible college students. They don't know about it, there's stigma, the application is horrible, and the 20-hour work requirement is a huge obstacle. But there's all kinds of things that can be done, and all kinds of things that are being done. We've been collecting solutions from all over the country for students, not much on faculty and staff. We're barely beginning to talk about that. But for students, we can do a lot. And my provost said, give me low-hanging fruit to pie in the sky. Okay, keeping SNAP outreach on campus is low-hanging fruit. Having a social media campaign, meeting students where they're at, that's kind of low-hanging fruit. Nothing's easy, and it requires staff time. We don't have enough staff. And we're trying to change at the state level, and in talking to our college presidents, that they need to take basic needs on as a responsibility. We've moved a long way into tutoring and doing all kinds of things outside of the classroom as to treat the whole person in higher ed. But we're not dealing with the very basics of the right to food and shelter. And it's going to take a lot of doing to convince our presidents, who'd never have enough resources and have all kinds of crises, that they've got to take on. And of course, you can make the return on investment argument. And we are making the return on an investment argument. I don't know it fluctuates around 40–45% of New Mexico college students ever graduate. They start but don't graduate. And what's even worse is they leave without a degree and debt. And that is ensuring for many a lifetime of downward mobility, not upward mobility. So I would like to raise the question, is higher ed actually indebting people and making people worse off? Then Catherine Sinkic would say, you're part of the problem. You got to be part of the solution. Next slide. We list things that staff and faculty can do. Students have told me that, financial aid staff don't believe how poor they are, don't believe that they have no one to turn to. We need trauma-informed and trauma-trained people. It's awful to be in these situations. And it's hidden. Students suffer in silence. Again, it's this American myth of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's your fault if you're in this position, or your family's fault. We've got to change that narrative. And we have to change the narrative of the privileged college student. I've been told that at the legislative level, they still think if you're going to college, you got two parents who are married, own a home, have intergenerational wealth. Really, in New Mexico, if we have impoverished children, they're not going to get suddenly wealthy because they showed up in college. In fact, it's the exact opposite, which makes me incredibly proud of our students. I'm working with these people who are working so hard to better themselves and their families. These guys are working just incredibly hard. So we need to do a lot on campus. We could use, for example, the FAFSA, the financial aid form. That should lead directly to SNAP benefits. If you're a Pell Grant student, we should send you information or make you automatically eligible for SNAP. That's kind of the low-hanging fruit. Someone's got to do the bureaucratic work of figuring out how we're going to send those emails out, blah, blah, blah. But that one's not so hard as getting the federal government to change the work requirement. We think we can change it. We think the governor can change our work requirement in the state. And we're working with people on a political strategy for moving that forward. Next one. Oh, and so this is one of my last slides talking about the SNAP gap, which I've already mentioned. And this has faculty and staff in it. The left column, 68% of people who are food insecure are not using SNAP in higher ed in New Mexico. And you can see 81% of faculty and staff, so that's a hurdle to overcome. But at our four-year schools, 75%. So this is one of the many solutions that we could work on and use your help on. Next slide. So what has come out of this as an exciting new consortium, we were the UNM Basic Needs Project, a couple of faculty researchers, and now through the study we have attracted people from all over the state, mostly student services staff who are on the front lines at our colleges and universities facing students in crisis every day. We're all coming together, we're meeting monthly into a consortium, and we're looking at these four pillars: food and nutrition security, housing security, financial stability, which we're just simply defining as access to federal benefits right now, because that is so much we can do right there. And then we want to work on curriculum. We need to train faculty and staff. We have to go through all these mandatory trainings in higher ed, chemical safety to shooter safety to mental health and diversity training. We should have a basic needs training for everyone. And so we're going to start working on that. We need to educate legislators, we need to educate sometimes our own presidents, college administration, and then teach first-year students, about resources, destigmatize them, teach them about the problem, you're not alone, but also these are the future, we need to teach the future. This is a thing that we need to solve, and it's going to take a long time. Pantries are for emergency assistance. Well, no longer, they're here to stay. We have them on most campuses. I don't know about most campuses. It's the #1 response in higher ed, our college pantries across the country and in New Mexico. And they're starting to do more and do more outreach and become locales to help students with basic needs. But we need much, much more than that to get at systemic causes. And one of the things is teaching. Underlying all we do is education, research, policy, and solution. Everyone needs to be educated. Policies need to change all over the place. University policy of ignoring the problem. I mean, it's not a written policy, but some of us would argue it's there sometimes. Research, we need data. We need data behind everything we do. There is no published data that pantries help retain students or help with nutrition. We're all probably collecting data at the pantry level. And so we're working on sharing that data and saying, we're collecting your student ID, let's track you. Is it helping? And anecdotally, students are telling us it's meant a lot, it saved my life. But we need more hard data. We want to argue for food scholarships. UNM did use our data when the food vendor contract came up. We used to have Chartwells. Chartwells said we can't accept SNAP on campus. We argued, worked with them for years. I believed them. I didn't know any better. Airmark came along during the application process, and we said, you've got to respond to food security. And they said, we'll accept SNAP on campus. So they're currently going through the legal hoops to be able to do that. We have little grocery spots on campus at UNM. They have to stock certain things to be SNAP eligible vendor, working all that out. It takes time, but they're doing it, and they're giving us hundreds of thousands of dollars in food scholarships. That's because we forced them to respond to our data. That's what the data is doing. Now, can we start a trend that way of getting the food service to have to respond? They can buy food at bulk. They can help us stock our pantries, our food closets that we're starting to distribute around campus, and solutions that we want to, we've spent a year collecting and analyzing the data, complaining, and now we want solutions. Now we want action. And we're picking very specific projects. We're working on SNAP. Everything having to do with SNAP is one group. We have a group working on pantries, how to make our pantries sustainable. Last I heard, UNM only provided the space. And I don't mean to be picking on UNM, but it's my home location, so I know the most. The pantry had to go to the church across the street for funding, and to Greek Life to hold fundraisers. And yet, we're pretty proud of it. We put it in the news when we launched it. Now we have to get, what does it mean to have a sustainable pantry? And the more we destigmatize it, the more people are using it. Right now, UNM doesn't allow faculty and staff in the pantry. CNM, I believe, does. NMSU does. And so we know that faculty and staff could use it. And in fact, faculty and staff have told us in our survey. Last slide is, along, I believe, with Roadrunner Food Bank, we are official White House Challenge members. So the UN has an End Global Hunger by 2030 initiative. The US has, as part of the Sustainable Development Goals, the US had, the Biden-Harris administration started a End Hunger in America by 2030. And so I'm saying to our consortium, let's take our little slice of the world and see what we can do by 2030. The University of California system had to cut hunger in half by 2025. It came from the regents level. We need to make our consortium that visible, that loud, but we're having monthly meetings. We just had a face-to-face conference at UNM. I have to say, President Stokes is investing in our consortium. Exciting things are happening. We've got the scholarship out of Aramark. We're bringing together the actors to approach the politicians or the governor to change the SNAP work requirement. But if we can be a united voice, we've got a chance. That have a real impact in New Mexico's workforce, family wealth. Getting a college degree is proven over and over and over to be extremely beneficial for the lifetime income of a person and their family. Despite what some of the news suggests at it not being worth it, it's worth it. It's totally worth it. I don't have the statistics off the top of my head that I should, but you're 3 times less likely to face poverty if you have a college degree as opposed to a high school degree. You're much less likely to be on federal benefits if you have a college degree. Ironically, unless you're teaching adjunct in higher ed. But I think maybe I'll stop there and open it up to questions or